The icy January wind bit through Emily's tattered coat as she huddled in a corner near Times Square, clutching a battered backpack filled with everything she owned. The streets bustled with holiday leftovers, cheerful tourists snapping photos, vendors hawking roasted chestnuts, but Emily was invisible to them. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the ache in her stomach was a familiar hollow void. As the sun dipped below the skyscrapers, she noticed a man standing a few feet away, his tailored overcoat and polished shoes sharply contrasting her surroundings. His silver hair gleamed under the streetlights, and his sharp blue eyes seemed out of place in his lined, weathered face. Richard Alden. The name flickered in her mind from a magazine headline she'd once read in a library, a rare escape from the cold. A billionaire, a philanthropist, a recluse. What was he doing here? Without a word, he extended a gloved hand toward her. Skeptical but too hungry to resist, Emily hesitated before grasping it. He led her to a sleek black car idling nearby, its driver impassive. Moments later, she found herself seated in a private dining room of an upscale restaurant, the scent of freshly baked bread overwhelming her senses. Plates of food were set before her, and she ate with the ferocity of someone who hadn't been given a choice between hunger and pride. Richard watched her with quiet curiosity. He didn't rush her or ask probing questions. It wasn't until her plate was nearly empty that he finally spoke, his voice gravelly yet soothing. He asked her about her life, her family, her dreams, things no one had asked in years. Emily felt her defenses crumbling as she recounted the story she rarely told. Losing her parents in a car crash at 16, bouncing between foster homes until she was old enough to be forgotten, and friends who disappeared when life got too hard. Richard nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never wavering. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill down her spine. He had a proposal, he said, one that would change her life. Marry him. In return, he promised her security, a home, and a life of luxury she could only dream of. Emily stared at him, the fork trembling in her hand. It sounded absurd, like the plot of a cheap romance novel. She barely knew this man, and his offer was too surreal to be real. But his expression was solemn, almost pleading. He told her his health was failing and that he needed a wife for reasons he couldn't yet disclose. That night, Emily lay awake in the hotel room Richard had arranged for her. The bed was softer than anything she'd ever felt, yet her mind raced. She didn't trust him, but what choice did she have? She could return to the streets where survival was a daily battle, or take a gamble on a man whose intentions were shrouded in mystery. By dawn, her decision was made. The morning of her wedding was unlike anything Emily had ever imagined. She woke to the sound of soft music playing from hidden speakers in her hotel suite. The luxurious gown laid out on the chaise lounge looked more like a work of art than a dress. It shimmered under the soft lighting, its intricate lace and pearl embellishments whispering of a life she had never known. Yet, as she prepared to step into this new reality, unease crept through her. The ceremony was held in a grand cathedral, its towering stained-glass windows casting vibrant colors across the room. Rows of gilded chairs were filled with faces Emily recognized only from television and magazines, celebrities, business magnates, and even politicians. The air buzzed with curiosity and gossip, and though the smiles aimed at her seemed genuine, she caught the whispers behind manicured hands. Who was this girl, this nobody, marrying one of the world's richest men? Richard stood at the altar, a picture of elegance in his tailored suit. Despite his age, there was a magnetic quality about him, a charisma that seemed to draw everyone in. When their eyes met, he gave her a reassuring nod, and for a moment her doubts wavered. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake. The reception seemed perfect, but Emily felt awkward and stiff in his arms, but Richard's ease and grace calmed her. He whispered small reassurances to her, his charm a balm to her frayed nerves. Yet even amid the celebration, Emily felt the weight of the room's scrutiny. The guests' eyes followed her every move, and she overheard fragments of conversations, speculations about her past, suspicions about Richard's motives. She wanted to escape, to retreat to a quiet corner and breathe, but there was no escaping this world now. When they arrived at Richard's estate later that night, Emily was awestruck. The mansion loomed like a castle, its sprawling grounds dotted with fountains and manicured gardens. Inside, every surface gleamed, marble floors, gilded frames, and priceless art. Yet, despite its opulence, the house felt cold, almost lifeless. The staff greeted them with practiced smiles, their bows and curtsies almost too deep. Emily noticed how they avoided Richard's gaze, their movements quick and nervous. It unsettled her, though Richard seemed unfazed. Over the following days, Richard lavished Emily with gifts, a wardrobe filled with designer dresses, rare jewelry, and even a sleek car she didn't know how to drive. He was attentive and kind, always ensuring she had everything she needed, but there was a strange distance in his gestures, as though he were following a script rather than acting out of genuine affection. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The staff's fearful glances, the locked rooms in the mansion, and Richard's evasiveness whenever she asked personal questions left her on edge. Her new life was luxurious, yes, but it was also suffocating. She began to wonder what she had truly agreed to and if she had traded one form of survival for another. The days blended into a blur of extravagance and unease. Emily's mornings began with breakfast, served on fine china in the sunlit dining room, while her afternoons were spent wandering the sprawling mansion. The gardens, the library, and the art gallery were all breathtaking, but the house had an eerie stillness, a sense that it held secrets she wasn't meant to uncover. One afternoon, while exploring, Emily stumbled upon a door unlike the others. It was heavy, made of dark wood, with an ornate gold lock that seemed to glint in the dim hallway light. She reached for the handle, but it didn't budge. Later that evening, during dinner, she casually mentioned the locked door to Richard, hoping for an explanation. His reaction was swift and unnerving. His charming demeanor vanished, replaced by a sternness she hadn't seen before. He told her firmly that the room was off limits and that she should focus on enjoying her new life rather than prying into matters that didn't concern her. The conversation left her shaken. From that moment on, Richard seemed to watch her more closely. He began dictating her daily activities, scheduling dinners, meetings with stylists, and even outings, ensuring she was never alone for too long. The lavish gifts kept coming, but they felt more like distractions than acts of kindness. Emily's unease grew, and she found solace in the company of Maria, a soft-spoken maid who had worked for Richard for decades. Maria's kindness was a rare comfort in the mansion's cold atmosphere. They often talked in the kitchen late at night when the house was quiet. One night, after Emily voiced her concerns about the locked door, Maria hesitated before speaking. Her words were careful, but her eyes betrayed fear. She mentioned that Richard had been married before, multiple times, but none of his previous wives had stayed. They had simply disappeared. The revelation sent chills down Emily's spine. She pressed Maria for details, but the maid grew evasive, whispering that it wasn't safe to talk about such things. Emily realized that the staff's deference and fear weren't merely a matter of respect. They knew something she didn't. Determined to find the truth, Emily began to dig into Richard's history. Using the mansion's vast library and her phone, she searched for any mention of his past marriages. Newspaper clippings and online articles painted a peculiar picture. Richard's previous wives were all young, charming women, but none was poor like her, and their marriages had all ended quietly. There were no divorce filings, no death announcements, just a sudden absence. The pieces didn't fit together, but the more Emily uncovered, the more certain she became that Richard was hiding something sinister. The locked room, the disappearances, and his increasingly controlling behavior formed a pattern she couldn't ignore. Emily knew she had to tread carefully. Richard was charming, but there was a darkness beneath his polished exterior. She resolved to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking everything. The mansion, once a symbol of her escape from poverty, now felt like a gilded cage, and she was determined to find a way out. The mansion was silent as Emily stood before the locked door, her heart pounding in her chest. After days of planning, she had managed to swipe a key from one of the staff members who, despite their nervous demeanor, didn't notice the theft. This was her moment. Taking a deep breath, she inserted the key, and the lock clicked open with a soft, ominous sound. The room was dark and musty, a stark contrast to the rest of the pristine mansion. As she stepped inside, her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through heavy curtains. The air was thick, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her stomach churn. Slowly she scanned the room, her gaze landing on shelves lined with boxes, each labeled with a woman's name. Emily's fingers trembled as she opened the first box. Inside, she found photographs of a smiling brunette in exotic locations, photos taken with Richard. Alongside them were letters, trinkets, and personal items, as though the woman's life had been catalogued and stored away. Emily moved to another box and found the same. A different woman, a different story, but the same haunting outcome. As she sifted through the contents, her unease deepened. Tucked beneath the photos and letters were legal documents, contracts, and deeds. Richard had systematically gained control of each woman's assets during their marriages. Properties, investments, bank accounts, all signed over to him just before their abrupt disappearances. Emily's mind raced. Why had he chosen her? She had no wealth, no property, no assets to her name. What could he possibly gain from her? The thought sent a chill down her spine. Perhaps she wasn't meant to understand yet, or perhaps her lack of resources made her expendable in a way that frightened her more than she could admit. Determined to confront him, Emily left the room and waited until dinner. Her nerves were raw as she carefully broached the subject, hinting at her discovery without revealing too much. Richard's reaction was calm, almost unnervingly so. He smiled, tilted his head, and explained away her concerns with practiced ease. He said the boxes were merely keepsakes of people who had been important to him, women he had cared for but who had chosen to leave. The documents? Routine precautions for shared finances. But his demeanor shifted subtly in the days that followed. He became more attentive, smothering her with affection she knew was meant to disarm her. His words, once reassuring, now felt manipulative. He told her she was imagining things, that her stressful past had made her overly suspicious. Slowly, she began to doubt herself. Could she have misread everything? At the same time, Richard's control tightened. Maria, who had been her confidant, was suddenly assigned to duties far from Emily. Other staff avoided her, their polite smiles tinged with pity. The once open doors of the mansion were now locked, restricting her movements. Emily's world was closing in, and she realized she was more trapped than ever. But she wasn't done fighting. She had to find a way to expose the truth before it was too late. Emily's hands trembled as she gripped the banister outside Richard's study. His low voice carried through the crack in the door, sharp and deliberate. Her breath caught as she heard him discussing plans with an unknown party, referencing legal documents, her name, and something about transferring control of her identity and finances. It made no sense. She had been homeless when they met, penniless, with no assets to her name. What could he possibly gain? Her confusion quickly turned to dread. Instead of confronting him again, she decided to dig deeper. She needed concrete evidence, something that could make sense of the strange puzzle she had stumbled into. That night, while Richard was away at an exclusive gala, Emily slipped back into the locked room. The air was heavier this time, the shadows in the room somehow darker. She sifted through the boxes with a newfound urgency, her hands flipping through papers and photos. Then, tucked beneath a stack of faded letters, she found a hidden compartment in one of the shelves. Inside was a single file with her name printed neatly on the tab. Her stomach twisted as she opened the file. It contained documents that outlined details she had never known about herself. Birth records, old photos of her as a toddler, and a legal document showing that she was the long-lost daughter of one of the wealthiest men in society, a man whose name, Alexander Whitmore, struck a faint chord of familiarity. She couldn't place him, but the realization hit her like a tidal wave. The inheritance tied to her name was staggering, a fortune she had never even dreamed of. Emily's legs felt weak. Richard had known all along. He had chosen her not because of her vulnerability or her tragic story, but because he had carefully orchestrated this situation. He had preyed on her ignorance, her desperation, and her lack of knowledge about her own identity. As the truth sank in, panic set in. She was trapped in a mansion with a man who had manipulated her from the start, a man who wouldn't hesitate to exploit her for his gain. Her heart raced as she realized she needed to leave. But Richard was always watching. The next morning, Emily found Maria in the kitchen. The maid's face was pale, her hands trembling as she washed dishes. Emily hesitated before speaking, her voice low and shaky as she confided everything she had uncovered. Maria's reaction was one of quiet horror, but she nodded in understanding. Maria agreed to help, but her warning was chilling. Richard was calculating and always seemed to be one step ahead. They would have to be careful. Emily couldn't just walk out the front door. She would need a solid plan, and it would require patience and cunning. Over the next few days, Maria worked discreetly, gathering supplies and mapping out a potential escape route. Emily's fear grew with each passing moment, knowing that Richard's web of control was tightening. She couldn't trust the staff, the locked doors, or even the lavish comforts of the mansion. As the day of her planned escape approached, Emily prepared herself for the fight of her life. She wasn't just running away. She was fighting for her freedom, her identity, and her future. And she knew Richard wouldn't let her go without a fight. The plan was simple. Maria would distract the guards stationed near the back entrance of the mansion while Emily slipped out through the kitchen. From there, she would cross the estate's sprawling gardens, climb the perimeter wall, and disappear into the nearby woods. Maria had even hidden a small backpack for her containing essentials: cash, a burner phone, and a map. Emily's heart pounded as the evening approached. She tried to remain calm, but every sound felt amplified. Every glance from the staff felt suspicious. Richard had been unusually attentive that day, almost as if he sensed something was amiss. He'd insisted they have dinner together, his gaze lingering on her a moment too long. She forced herself to smile, her mind racing with fear and determination. When the clock struck midnight, Emily crept through the darkened halls, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpeting. She reached the kitchen, her pulse quickening as she saw Maria casually chatting with the guard. Maria glanced at her briefly, giving a subtle nod, and Emily slipped out the door. The cool night air hit her like a wave, and she sprinted across the garden, the backpack bouncing against her shoulder. Adrenaline surged as she reached the perimeter wall, its height more daunting than she'd remembered. She climbed with trembling hands, her muscles straining as she hauled herself over. Just as she landed on the other side, a blaring alarm shattered the silence. She froze, her heart dropping. She had triggered a motion sensor. Before she could run, the sound of barking dogs filled the air, followed by the beam of flashlights cutting through the darkness. Richard's security team closed in quickly, their voices sharp and commanding. Emily tried to run, but they caught her within moments, dragging her back toward the mansion as she kicked and screamed. When they reached the grand foyer, Richard was waiting. He stood at the bottom of the staircase, his expression a mix of disappointment and feigned concern. He approached her slowly, brushing a hand against her tear-streaked face as she flinched. His words were calm but patronizing, painting her as a fragile woman struggling with paranoia and delusions. The security team exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of what to believe. Richard dismissed them with a wave, leading Emily upstairs as she fumed silently. In the days that followed, Emily was under constant surveillance. The mansion felt smaller, its luxurious confines now suffocating. Maria was sent away on temporary leave, leaving Emily completely isolated. But Emily refused to give up. While searching the library for information about Richard, she came across something unexpected: a photo of a young man with Richard, his arms stiffly draped over the boy's shoulders. The name scribbled in the corner read Michael Alden. Emily began her search for Michael, eventually finding an article about him online. He was estranged from his father and had openly accused Richard of corruption in interviews. Desperate, Emily used the burner phone Maria had left her to contact him. Michael's response was swift and cautious. He agreed to meet her but warned her of the danger she was in. Richard, he explained, was not a man who tolerated betrayal. Emily knew the stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. If she could align with Michael, she might finally have a chance to escape Richard's grip and expose his dark secrets. Emily and Michael devised their plan in hushed conversations over burner phones and carefully written notes. They agreed that the key to taking down Richard lay in gathering irrefutable evidence. Michael, familiar with his father's penchant for control, warned her that the mansion was likely littered with hidden cameras and microphones. Emily's task was to locate them, document their findings, and send the footage to Michael. Returning to the mansion after their secret meeting, Emily feigned normalcy. She smiled through dinners with Richard, thanked him for his lavish gifts, and even engaged in conversations about their future. Meanwhile, she began scouring the mansion during her limited moments of privacy. It didn't take long to find the cameras, discreetly tucked into corners, behind ornate decorations, and inside light fixtures. Using a hidden recorder Michael had provided, she began collecting clips of Richard's behavior, his controlling demeanor, his phone calls laced with cryptic instructions, and his tense conversations with the staff. As days passed, Richard's demeanor shifted. He became more observant, his eyes lingering on her as though he sensed something was off. Security tightened around the mansion. The staff, once polite but distant, now avoided her altogether. The air in the mansion grew heavier, and Emily knew Richard was onto her. To divert his suspicions, she pretended to reconcile with him. She apologized for her outburst during her failed escape and expressed gratitude for his patience. Her act seemed to work, and Richard's guard lowered just enough for her to continue gathering evidence. One evening, while Richard attended a late meeting, Emily ventured into his study. She had noticed him entering it late at night and locking the door behind him. With a paperclip she had smuggled into her pocket, she picked the lock, her hands trembling. Inside, she found a safe hidden behind a large painting. Using the combination Michael had guessed based on his father's habits, she opened it. Inside the safe were stacks of cash, legal documents bearing the names of Richard's previous wives, and a folder with her name on it. She flipped through its contents, her breath catching. The documents detailed plans to gain control over her legal identity and financial inheritance, an inheritance she never even knew she had. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She took pictures of everything with her burner phone and returned the documents to their place. As she exited the study, she nearly ran into Richard. His eyes narrowed. He asked her what she was doing, his voice calm, but his gaze piercing. Emily feigned innocence, saying she had been looking for a book. He didn't press further but watched her closely for the rest of the evening, making her acutely aware that time was running out. Emily sent the evidence to Michael that night, praying he could act before Richard discovered her duplicity. The mansion had become a battlefield, and every moment felt like a precarious dance on the edge of disaster. A month after her marriage to Richard, Emily stumbled upon a journal tucked away in his bedroom while carrying out her search for evidence. Hidden beneath a false bottom in one of his drawers, the leather-bound book radiated an aura of foreboding. She hesitated before opening it, fearing what she might find, but curiosity and desperation propelled her forward. The entries were chilling. Richard had detailed his plan to eliminate her after gaining control of her legal identity. He had written about how her father, a wealthy and influential figure, had wronged him in the past. Emily's inheritance was just a means to an end, a tool to dismantle her father's empire piece by piece. Emily's stomach churned as she read about his calculated manipulation. Richard had chosen her precisely because of her vulnerability, knowing she would be easy to control. Yet, his arrogance also made him careless, leaving a trail of clues that she and Michael had begun to unravel. When Richard returned that evening, Emily decided it was time for confrontation. She sat across from him in the grand living room, her hands trembling but her voice steady. She revealed the evidence she had collected, her words laced with quiet defiance. Richard didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a slow, sinister smile spreading across his face. He mocked her for thinking she could outmaneuver him, calling her attempts at rebellion laughable. He confessed to everything, his schemes, his hatred for her father, and his plan to use her as a pawn in his vendetta. But as Richard gloated, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the mansion. Michael and a team of authorities burst into the room, their presence shattering the tension like glass. Richard's composure faltered for the first time. He stood, his face a mask of fury, as Michael confronted him. Emily stepped aside, her heart pounding as years of Richard's deceit began to unravel before her eyes. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Emily felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore, and together She and Michael would ensure Richard faced justice. As Michael and the authorities stormed the room, Richard instinctively moved toward the nearest exit. His confidence had cracked, and panic began to seep through his calculated facade. He made a desperate attempt to flee, but the agents were faster. They cornered him in the hallway, placing him under arrest for fraud, illegal asset seizure, and conspiracy. Emily watched as Richard's mask slipped entirely, revealing a man who had thrived on manipulation and control, but now faced the consequences of his actions. His fury turned to desperation as he shouted empty denials, his words ignored by the agents. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Emily testified in court, recounting her harrowing experiences and exposing Richard's web of deceit. Her testimony was pivotal, shining a light on his predatory behavior and the tragic stories of the women who had come before her. The courtroom was packed with reporters, and the media erupted with the scandal. Emily's courage became a beacon of hope for others, her story widely shared as an example of resilience and determination. With Michael and Maria's unwavering support, she began to rebuild her life. The two of them stood by her through every challenge, ensuring she never felt alone again. When Emily finally reunited with her father, emotions ran high. He recognized her immediately, his eyes welling with tears as he embraced her. She showed him the document she had found in Richard's secret room, revealing how Richard had planned to use her as a pawn in his vendetta. Her father's disappointment and regret were evident, but he vowed to make amends. Her father welcomed her back into his life, providing her with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Emily used part of the recovered fortune from Richard's fraudulent dealings to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting abused and vulnerable women. The foundation quickly gained traction, helping countless individuals escape dangerous situations and start anew. Though Emily struggled with lingering fear and the scars of her ordeal, she found strength in her new purpose. Her life, once a tale of survival, transformed into a journey of empowerment and advocacy. Sitting on the steps of her foundation's headquarters, Emily reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Her life had been a whirlwind of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. But through it all, she had discovered the importance of self-worth, vigilance, and inner strength. Publicly sharing her story had been daunting, but it had also been liberating. She wanted others to recognize the signs of manipulation and abuse, to understand that leaving a toxic relationship was not just an option, but a necessity. Her story inspired many, and the foundation she had started became a sanctuary for women seeking safety and support. Emily also became a fierce advocate for legal reforms, pushing for laws that better protected individuals from exploitation. Her work gained national attention, and she emerged as a public figure devoted to creating systemic change. One crisp autumn day, Emily returned to the now-abandoned mansion. Its grandeur had faded, its eerie silence replaced by the weight of memories. Walking through its empty halls, she felt a mix of sorrow and relief. This place, once her prison, had also been the catalyst for her transformation. As she stepped outside, Emily turned back one last time, her heart filled with gratitude for the strength she had found. The mansion, a relic of her past, was no longer a part of her future. She had built a life of purpose and hope, and she walked away with her head held high, ready for whatever came next. What do you think about Emily's bravery and determination to be free? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching and for being part of this journey with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. We'll see you in the next video.